Okay, well, come on in, everybody. We'll get started in just a moment. The recording does start as soon as I open the room. So we'll assume you folks are here. Most everybody who wants to be here should be here on time. All right. So welcome, everybody, to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And then this edition of the Meetup being recorded Thursday, October 15, 2020 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, and which is our 273rd episode. We're glad to have Gavin Pickin back. Oh, and I see I have the typo there. I apologize. It's Pickin.
That's okay. It happened all my life.
Yeah, right. And me too. Earhart, you will misspell that. So I apologize. I caught that earlier and I just missed it on this slide. Anyway, he's here to give the first part of what will be a couple talks on APIs. And this one will be building APIs with ColdFusion. Part 1, start coding APIs today. Awesome. So with that, Gavin, thanks for coming on. I'll make your screen come up and take it away.
Very cool. Well, thanks everybody for having me. Appreciate everyone coming out to check this out, and hopefully it's going to be a good session. And this is part 1. So part 1 today, we're going to start looking at coding APIs today, and then we're going to have a part 2 later in November. Charlie will be scheduling that here pretty soon. And so with that being said, let's get on with this. So who am I? No one really cares, but for those who do care later, I'm going to put a slide in here. Basically, I work for Order Solutions. I have done for 5 or so years. I work with ColdBox, CommandBox, ContentBox, APIs, and Vue.js every day. Been working with ColdFusion a long time, other stuff just as long. I talk funny because I come from New Zealand, I live in California, etc. So the big thing is I love learning, and I like to share the lessons I learn, and this is one of my ways to share and give back, and so that's why I'm here. So why should I give this talk? Well, as I mentioned, I work with APIs every day. So I build a lot of APIs for customers. And with Audis, we build, maintain, and convert a lot of legacy ColdFusion sites for people. That's one of the biggest jobs that we do is we help people take their legacy sites and make them more modern, more efficient, more maintainable. And that's part of what I do every day. And I've seen many different ways to build an API. I've built APIs many different ways over the years. And so basically, I think I've got a lot of lessons I could share and learn. Hopefully you'll learn something, and hopefully it might be useful, what you learn. So is this how I build APIs today? No, this is not how I build APIs today. I'll be doing another part in November, part 2, where I'll show you how I build them today with all the cool tools and libraries and everything that I use. But why share this presentation? Well, not everyone can start a greenfield project, right? Not everyone has the luxury of starting with a new project from scratch, being able to pick and choose exactly what they want. Not everybody can use frameworks and libraries. Some companies have restrictions on what they can and can't use, and not everyone needs a full-blown API with all the bells and whistles. They don't need JWT and everything else. Sometimes they just need to sprinkle a little API in their existing app. And so today I'm going to share a lot of different things, and a lot of things you probably already use, maybe you already know, maybe things you don't. But I wanted to sort of walk you through some of those, and hopefully you guys can get a taste of what it is with an API. And as we evolve it, like I say, part 2, we'll look at bigger, better ways. And like I said, better is my opinion. Everyone has their own opinions, but that's basically why I want to share this. So what is an API? Well, an API is application programming interface, but really when people say APIs today, they usually think of a JSON API that we communicate via, Ajax or Postman or something like that to communicate with a web server that gives us back JSON. A lot of times people assume when we say an API, we're usually talking about REST APIs in JSON, but not always. I'll talk a little bit in a second about REST, but I'm not going to be explaining what is an API and what is REST and everything. I assume you have some idea about that, and if you want to find out more, there's a lot of presentations on that. But the other thing too is, APIs can be XML, SOAP, those types of things, but it's very common to talk about JSON APIs, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on today, although most of it is relatable. So if you choose to, use XML instead of JSON, that's fine. If you're using SOAP, a lot of the similar things can, evolve from what we're talking about today. So what's the difference between a REST JSON API and a JSON API? Well, REST, you probably heard, is an acronym for representational state transfer. Basically, it's an architectural style for distributed hypermedia systems that was first presented by Roy Fielding back in 2000. A very famous dissertation, and it's a common cause of arguments ever since, basically. The long and short of it is, all REST is our APIs, but not all APIs are REST. And so you may have more REST-like API in your example than someone else. If you're strictly REST, it's kind of like Agile. You're either more Agile or less Agile, but no one is usually 100% exactly Agile. And so the big thing is you want to learn from the good things of REST and absorb those. And there's a lot of good parts in REST that we sort of like to use. And one of the big things is the guiding principles. So, it's a client server stateless. That's an important one too. We want to make sure that every request can live on its own. So that's usually a guiding principle of REST. You could build your API with sessions though, built in with your ColdFusion server, the way you've always done, normal apps. And that would mean it's not as RESTful as some of the other things, but maybe you're doing some other pieces. So it's cacheable, uniform interface, layered system, and the code on demand is kind of an interesting one. But the big thing most people think about with REST, though, is thinking in terms of resources. So information that can be named can be a resource, like a document or an image or a user or tweet, something like that, where we're basically talking about a resource and how you can act on that resource. And that sort of idea, and usually the routing system or the URLs you hit to get there all focus around the resource. And that's what people sort of associate with REST. But like I said, I'm not a REST expert. I try and build RESTful APIs, and that might be more RESTful or less RESTful than yours, but that's sort of the goal. And there's a lot of goodness behind these principles. And if you Google REST, you can find out more about each one and what makes them important and what makes them tick. Okay, so what app are we going to work on today? There's no presentation that's complete without some type of example or demo. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be working on Soapbox. So Soapbox is a Twitter clone we built for our ColdBox Zero to Hero training that I do. We've given this at lots of conferences before CF Summit, our own conference, Into the Box. And so in that class, we try and take you from a relative zero in ColdBox and try and get you up to a hero using a lot of different modules, learning the framework, how ForgeBox and CommandBox can give you power through other modules and everything else. But I modified it for this presentation. So don't worry, you don't have to know ColdBox. You don't have to know any of that stuff. It's being modified. And how did I modify it? So I purposely removed a lot of things. So this should resemble a very, very legacy app. So I removed the framework. So there's no ColdBox in it. I removed the ColdBox modules and everything like bcrypt. I removed dependency injection like Wirebox. I removed the OO objects as well. I removed the registration module just because it didn't need every part of the app to be working to show off some API components. I did leave in a few modern-ish components though. So I am using CommandBox to start the server. So if you guys want to download the code later and run it yourself, it's easier to start up and get running with CommandBox. I used the .env file and cfconfig so I could get my data source set up to run the database. And I have a couple of CFCs in there for some business logic. So it's not like the oldest, ugliest app ever, but it's definitely not the way it'd work today. And I have to say, it was painful to build this after being spoiled by ColdBox all these years, having all the framework, the tools, and how easy it makes a lot of things. So a few things I was trying to do, and I realized, wait a minute, that's not a ColdFusion feature. That's actually a ColdBox feature. And I'll probably explain a couple of those later. But anyway, long story short, this app is ready to be shown to you guys, and we can add some API functionality to it. So before we jump into this, let me go back and actually show you the app itself. Okay, so here's my app, Soapbox. So Soapbox is basically a Twitter clone. Okay, so Order Solutions, yeah, we like to get up there and rant and rave on our Soapbox about how we love our framework and it's so awesome and everything else. And people usually think we're just like a politician up there ranting and raving. And so we decided to call our Twitter clone Soapbox because, yep, we get up on our soapbox and rant and rave. And so instead of calling them tweets, we call them rants. So if I want to start a new rant, I can rant. And then obviously we're going to get a list of rants here. And in true Twitter clone style, you can fist bump the good rants and you can poo-poo on the bad rants, or chocolate ice cream swirly emoticon if you prefer that instead. So not too complicated. We have a login here. So if I want to log in, I can log in as Gavin. And for the purposes of this, since I removed bcrypt, any password will do. It is using bcrypt in the database, but it just skips the password check here. So if I log in, we have other options pop up. Now we can log out. Now we can actually log in and create a rant. So hello to the online CF meetup. I can rant about it, and unless I broke everything, it works. Okay, if I click on me, I can see a list of all my rants in here. If I go back to the home page, I can see, oh, there was some guy called Jeff who was in here too, and he likes to talk. And he's got just one rant there. So I guess he doesn't like to talk that much. So let me show you the code of what we have to show you it really is legacy. Okay, so in here we have, as I mentioned, there's a .cfconfig, so we could set up a data source. We have a .env and a .env example, but nothing too fancy there. So we have an action login page. So this is how we log in. So I'm using a user CFC, and I'm getting by username, passing the form URL. I'm actually logging in using my security CFC, and then I'm redirecting. I have my index page, lists all my rants. So I'm using a CF include to loop over my rants here. If the array is empty, I'm just doing ifs. I'm using includes for my header and footer. There's no fancy framework layouts or anything there. So I've got a header file and just traditional HTML. Again, it's got a couple of CFC checks to see if you're logged in or not. The footer files, just basically a bunch of JavaScript and everything in there, some styles. So my login form includes the header and footer. So this is pretty much what I used to build when I first started ColdFusion way back in the late 90s, Actually, but CFCs weren't there, so that's a little bit, past. But we got a log out here as well. In our CFCs folder, we have a rant CFC, which gets us a list of rants from the database. It returns it as an array of structs because we're using Lucy here, so we can do that. If I want to list them by user, I pass in a user ID, I run the query, passing in the argument and getting a return type of array. So right now you see I've got I can create a rant here. My users, I can get user by username. So pretty straightforward, nothing too fancy, nothing fancy at all really. It's just storing a logged in user ID in the session. We're abstracting away through the security CFC. So basically that's the code here. In my includes, I've got a CSS file and the different pages using folders. I don't have any routing system set up in here. So if you want rant/new to work, you go to a rants folder and put a new file in there for the new rant. If you're not logged in, it redirects you. Pretty standard, pretty straightforward. So I thought this was a good starting point, a nice baseline. And then basically at the, this sort of would work for anyone. There's nothing special in here which should stop you from doing, any API work with your app. Okay, so now we've seen that a little bit. Let's just check the questions in here real quick. See if anyone's asking anything. Okay, just making sure, no questions so far. So let's get into it. So I'm going to basically go through an iterative process of an API and sort of show you different ways, and we'll just keep building on it. So version 1. So in version 1, we just use a CFM file, right, in a folder, just to allow the versioning sort of to kick in and work. We're going to make a folder called API v1, and inside of that, I'm going to put a users and then index.cfm. And that allows us to do something like this. So we can hit API/v1/users and pass in our user ID. So in the browser, we're going to look and see what this looks like. Okay. Sorry, I disconnected all my links because when I copy pasted them, they're all not working, right? So let me come in here. Okay. When we hit this here, let me blow this up a little bit. And we view page source. We're returning some JSON. So how are we doing that? Okay, we'll close all these other files off and look at our API. So I've got lots of versions in here and we'll get through them. But basically, I just have an index.cfm. And so if the user ID is passed in, then I'm just going to serialize JSON, my CFC that uses, and then I'm going to get, passing that ID in. I'm basically just taking that struct, serializing it, and returning it. Okay. So that's like the simplest API we have. Okay. We basically use a CFC, or you could write your query right in here, or whatever you need to, and just serialize it to JSON. Now, obviously, there's some pros and cons to doing something like this, right? So as we go, we're going to discuss the issues. But we're also going to use Postman, because Postman's a really good tool. And I want to show you guys how to look at your API. And most people use something like this. So Postman here, and this is hard to blow up, so I apologize for everybody. But if we hit that URL, pass that in, and we send it, we get a response back here. You get lots of information back. So you get status codes, time, bytes. You get, cookies, headers, any test results. You can see the pretty version, the raw version, the preview. And so this is a really nice tool for looking at your APIs. Okay, so most of the time we're going to look at them both ways, through the browser and through Postman. But as we get more complicated, Postman's definitely the way to go. So, okay, so that's version 1, right? So it does the job, right? It's JSON, but without that mime type, not much will actually think it's JSON. So if you use ColdFusion to read it, you can get it back and you can treat it like JSON. But most things, if you use like a jQuery and make a jQuery AJAX response, it's not going to come back knowing it's JSON. You have to sort of treat it like JSON. You have to force it to make it think it's JSON. So let's go to version 2. So version 2, we're actually going to add the mime type to it, okay? And that way, now when we look at it, it looks a little different. So we'll open the browser. Now you see my extension's already picked it up. So same data, but now I have an extension I installed that reads JSON. Because the mime type, the extension kicked in, it automatically treated it the right way. And then if we look in Postman here, I've got a collection here, so I can go to version 2. And I can look at this request. So when I run the version 2 one, now you can see there's a pretty version. It automatically passes it and makes it look good. You can still see the raw. You can still see the preview, but the pretty version is what, so it gives you a hint of what other tools are going to see this like. You can see that there's a status, everything there. So far, so good. So if you're using, a little bit of Vue.js in your site and you need an API, basically, this is all you need to get up and running. We just pass that CF content type of application JSON, and then we serialize it. And now, theoretically, this is an API. It's not a RESTful API or anything else, but that's a good starting point for your API. Okay, so then next, window here. So pros and cons. So now it's JSON with the right mime type. As I mentioned, the browser extensions, Postman, process in JSON. But some of you might think, well, don't CFCs support API-like responses already? You're right. So that was actually introduced a long time ago. So let's have a look at version 3. So in version 3, we're going to use a CFC for our API endpoint. So in the browser, you see the URL changes a little bit. So we can actually hit CFCs, user.cfc, and we have the method of get and the user ID of 5. So let's look at that and see what it does. Okay, so we got a nice fat error there. If I go to our CFCs users, The short of it is that without the remote access, so access equals remote on our CFC, ColdFusion doesn't let you hit the CFC basically directly like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a user CFC in our version 3 just so we can access it and we can make updates as we go. But so what we do essentially is add access equals remote on here. And the difference is now ColdFusion will actually allow you to access it. So let's have a look at the other version here. So if we go to API/v3 users.cfc, we can pass in that method equals get. So whatever the method in there, whatever the function in that CFC is you want to hit, you can use method equals and then pass in your parameters. So let's have a look, see what it does in the browser. And by default, we get this WDDX packet. So that's pretty nice. Right out of the box, all we had to do really was just add the access equals remote. Nothing else changed. We did move the file, but like I said, that's more for our versioning for this. But that's pretty neat. So if we go into here and go to version 3, you can see that DDX packet right here. Okay, so before I get too far, any other questions in here?
Yeah, could you bump up the font in VS Code as the request?
Okay, sure.
Thank you, sir.
Better. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. I am going to make all the code available too after the fact, just so you know, the database, slides, etc. Okay, so version 3, we're using a CFC. We have access equals remote, and now basically what we get is we get just WDDX. Okay, XML is cool and all, but we like JSON. So what can we do next? Okay, so what we're going to do, version 3, as I said, adding an access equals remote was pretty easy, but for a lot of people, WDDX is a pain to work with. Can't we get JSON back instead? So we can add return format equals JSON to the function. You could set something in your application, on request, your request event to set the URL format to JSON automatically, so it always defaults to that. But that may interfere with some other things as well. So again, a lot of people, think of APIs, they think of JSON. WDDX has actually got some pretty nice features, but 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So let's look at version 4. Well, yeah, so version 4, we'll see what else we can do here. So what API stuff haven't we covered yet? We really just touched on the basics, right? But a big thing is errors. What if we try and hit this version 3 and we look for a user ID that doesn't exist? Okay, so let me pull it up in Postman here. If I try and pull up number 12, I get this not so pretty version. If I go look at the preview, you see I've got a nice dump here of everything out. So it's not very user friendly. This isn't this. If you had some JavaScript that was trying to call your API and it threw out something like this would be pretty bad. So what we really need to do is add some error handling into our user CFC. Okay, so we're going to evolve it a little bit more. So let's go to version 4. So now we have our access equals remote. We're going to change that return format to JSON so we get JSON back. And in here, we're going to check to see the length of the user array. Okay, so right here, we're getting a query and we're getting basically an array back. And if it has a length, then we're going to return the first user. Otherwise, we're going to return a struct error message user not found. Okay, so if we come in here and go to version 4, now if we have an error, you're going to see we got a nice little pretty error, user not found. And if we get a success, we get our nice pretty JSON back again. So pros and cons with that. So it worked. What we did worked. But now, if you noticed, on a success, we get a 200 OK. On an error, we still get a 200 OK. So working with something like that, it's not very user friendly or API friendly. If you do a CF HTTP request to something and it gives back a 200, you're going to think it was successful. So status codes, are important. And did you actually know that like jQuery AJAX requests actually treat success and errors differently? So depending on your status code, you'll have to actually handle the response differently. So that's very important to know. If you get a 500 error back or a 400 error back or 200 error back, they all mean something. Those status codes mean something, and those conventions, are very important. It makes it easier and more user friendly for those, software and people developing it there. Okay, so version 5. Let's add something in here for status code and status text until I use a CFC. Okay, so version 5. So now what we have is we have our query, we have our same error catching, but now what happens is if it's an error, if we can't find them, we're going to use a status code of 404, and we're going to set the status text equals not found. So now if we go to Looking Postman here, version 4, and we have, is that version 4? Version 5, sorry. So if we go to version 5 now, and we look at a success, everything looks the same. We still have our 200 okay. We have our data back as expected. Everything's great. But now if we go to our error, and we run our error, so we have the different user ID, it's going to give us an error here. We're going to get the error message, user not found, just like before. But now we have a status 404, not found. And so this is, this is a better way to handle errors, to give it a different status code. 200 should be used for successes. And then if you have an error, try and find a status code that sort of matches as closely as possible. So not found, a 404 is, good. You've got, 401, 403, so permission denied or not authenticated. You've got 418, I think, is a teapot, or is that validation? I always get those confused. There's a couple of strange ones in there from April Fools. But if you look up status codes, there's a lot of good ones, and we'll show you some of those shortly here as well. But using the right error message definitely helps as for the programmer trying to work your API, but also the applications they're actually working with as well. Okay, so now we have a possible thing, like what if we want more than one error message? So maybe you have to do some validation and they submit a form to create a new user, but the username's too short and the password doesn't have enough funny characters in it, and you want to give back lots of messages. So what we have right now doesn't really work, right? So let's look at version 6. So version 6, what we're going to do is we're going to add an array of error messages into our user CFC, and that way we can have one or as many as we need to. Okay. So we close down some of these files. So version 6 user CFC. So now what we have here, everything's the same, but when we're returning, now we're going to have error messages and we have an array. So we have one message, we have two messages. Okay. So what does that look like? We go to version 6. Again, if we do a successful post, 200 okay, we get our data back. So everything's fine. We're just working on the error. So if we do an error message now you see we have error messages. The key is not changed, but now we have an array and we got more than one. We still get the 404 not found. And so now we're evolving, right? Our API is expanding and evolving. And so before we just had one message, now we have multiple. So what's the pros and cons where we're at now? Consistency. So one of the biggest things is if you had one message before and now you have multiple messages, is your API going to be consistent? Right now we have to check the status code to know how to handle a response. Sometimes it's a struct with values in it. Sometimes it might just be an array. Sometimes, there may be lots of different ways we return our message. Sometimes it has error messages. Sometimes it doesn't. What if we want to send our data packet, back on a success and have messages with it? Are they only error messages? Do we add a new key for messages? What if we want an easier way to look for an error? So there's lots of things that you probably will do and you'll probably evolve. And so let's look at some of the ways we can maybe handle this. So let's add a Boolean for error or for success and failures. And so that way, every packet is always consistent. So we always have that key no matter what. If successful or not, we have a key and we can check the Boolean to see if it's there or not. Okay. So let's always add a data value, so we always have a key for that. So that way our data packet looks the same no matter what, just different things will be empty or full. Okay. So let's have a look and see what that looks like. So version 7. Okay, now we're getting a little more. So we got our query at the top. We're checking, and now instead of just returning that user one, we're basically passing in. We're making a struct. So we have an inline struct here. So for the data key, we're giving back the user. Error messages, right now we're giving back an empty array, and then we have an error equals false. Okay, so on the other side, they can just say, look at the response and say if error is true, then handle the error. If it's false, then treat it like it's a success. We got our data, we can do something with it. So if we have an error here, what we're going to do is send back our 404 not found again. And here we have our return. So we're going to have an empty data key. Error is going to be true. And then we're going to have an array of error messages here. So we can pass back the messages that we want to with this. And so on some of them, we may have one message, on some we may have 5. But now our data packet's going to be the same across all of our endpoints, right? And that's a big key. You want to be consistent. You want to make it easy for your programmer, but also the apps that are working with it. Okay, so let's see what this does now. So version 7. So if I hit this here and fire it up, now I get a success. So my error, nope, false. There's no errors, so I don't have to worry about the error process. So now in the data, I have my values. And if the data was an array of objects, it would be an array. It could be a struct, but I always know that in the data is where my data lives. If there's nothing in it, then there's nothing in it. But that way I always know the keys exist. And error messages, for a success, we have no error messages, so that's empty array. But for our error now, if we run that, you'll see error set to true. So now we have an easy way to just check to see if there's an error. We don't have to check to see if the array is empty. We can just say, check the error. Is it true or false? It's easier, more consistent. We have our data set up here and our error messages. Now, again, this is just one set of conventions, and you'll kind of evolve over time, and everybody will have their own thing. So just because I said error, maybe yours is success, right? It's up to you. But that brings us to the next point. What if someone who doesn't work on the API much gets confused? Maybe they put success equals true or false instead of error. What if they decide to call data something else? Or maybe they don't want to use error messages, they just use messages, because why would you have error messages on a success? Okay, so some of those things might pop up. And then what if you want to add a new key in there? Maybe you want to add pagination, which is something we just did not too long ago for a client. So we wanted to add pagination, and the pagination, now we decide to add that on every response, no matter what. So now we have a new key for pagination, right? And that was the interesting thing. If we did it old school, we'd have to remember to go change every single place that we put that. We'd have to make sure we changed all the keys. We have to do find and replace, and it'd be really kind of tedious. So why don't we use some objects here to make our response more consistent, give it some structure, and make it more modern. We can even use chaining. I mean, you guys love jQuery, right? Chaining is where it's at. So let's look at version 8. So let's give ourselves a little more structure and try and make our life a little easier here. Okay, so version 8. So now in here, we have a response. Obviously, this response object doesn't have to be in this version, but because we're evolving, that's why we put it here. Normally, I'd put the response at the top level of the API so everything can use it. So let's have a look at what my response object does. First of all, it has accesses set to true. So that way I can use gets and sets to make the object more accessible. Okay, and so what I'm storing here is I'm storing our keys, right? Our data key, which is defaulting to nothing. our error, which defaults to false, and then our messages. We're not going to use error messages because, as I mentioned, error messages is not as informative as just messages. Messages makes more sense. If it's an error, there'd be error messages. If it's success, then there'll be successful messages. So we're just going to call it messages, and that's going to be array. Okay, so when we initialize this response, we set the data to an empty struct, or we set the error to false, and we set their messages to an empty array. Okay, and now what we can do is when we call get on this function, on the CFC, we can actually return our structure. Okay, so this gives us a nice easy way, sorry about the pop-ups there, gives us a nice easy way to always make sure our keys are named the same, our data is named the same. And so now instead of having to output this every single time and have typos and mistakes and problems, we can actually use something like this. So now, instead of having to remember all the different keys we need for a successful response, we just say, we create the new response up here. And then here we say response.setData, and we give it the data we want. And then we're just going to return the get. So maybe you might call it render it or output or whatever you want to call it. I just called it get. And again, it's just an example. So now, by doing this, if we look at version 8 of Success in Postman here, now you see the data is outputted, all the data is there because we set the data, and by default, it defaults to an error of false and array messages of nothing. So that's great. Let's look down here at the error setup. So instead of having to remember how to build the struct, we just need to say response.setError true, and then set messages, and we just pass in our array, and then we call get. And so now, if we added another key in here that we want to show everywhere, so maybe we wanted to add a key for date created, something like that. You could output that every time. Maybe you could put a key in there for how long the request took or something. You know, if there's something you want to add to everything, all of a sudden you have the ability to do that because you've abstracted away that piece into an object. And so now we have this chaining. So response.setError.setMessages.get. It's a little more modern, a little better. I like that. Okay. So do we see this error message? No, we didn't. So let's check out the error here. And as expected, it's not anything different except for now we're using messages instead of error messages because I made that choice. Okay, so now version 8. Got a lot of versions. This is not how quickly I would version my code, but for the evolution here, this makes sense. So let's look at version 9. Oh, sorry. Let's look at version 8. What do you think about 8? So right now, with the access is set, so we do set messages. We have to replace the whole array of messages. It's not very user friendly. You know, what if somebody else added a message and then you're adding more messages? You're just going to replace it, or maybe you have to read them out and then you have to add a pin to the array and then send it back in. So interesting. Maybe we could do that better. And then having to manually add the header for status code and text everywhere isn't very friendly either. So can we make that better? Sure. So let's add a helper method for add message, which appends one or more messages. So it doesn't replace, it doesn't set, it just adds to it. Let's also add support for the status code and text in the response. So again, this is just one way to do it. So now in my response, I've actually added a status code and a status text in here as data. So I have a status code of 200, and I have my OK, which is the default status text for 200. So when we initialize them, we're setting them here. And now when we do the get, and that's why I was thinking maybe output or render would be a better name or something, but when you call that function, it actually is going to create a header. So status code with the status code we have set here and the status text, and then return the information here. So an error, if there is one, messages, and data. Okay, so how do we use that? So now, nothing really changes on the successful, right? We just get the response, set the data, and then get it, which returns it, does the work. Now, if we want to set an error, we do response.set status code. We can set the status text to not found. We can set an error to true. We can add a message, user not found, add another message, you do not have permission to access that user, and then get. So chainable, nice, neat. It's better than having, header codes everywhere. Now we don't have to worry about remembering to, update them. We've got nice little helpers. It's getting there. It's still not perfect, but it's getting there. So let's look at Postman and see what it does for version 9. So in version 9, as you can see, it's all cosmetic. Everything else is behind the scenes. Nothing else changed. We still got our 404 here. The status, the header is being set correctly. Our data is coming out the right way. If we change this to successful, we get our data back. Everything looks good. We still got our 200 okay. So everything is working there. Okay. So pros and cons here. So what about more headers? What if I want to add cause headers? Because if you ever deal with APIs and you're using it from other domains, cause is going to be a problem. Trust me, you'll deal with it. So maybe we want to add more headers to our responses. So maybe cause. Okay. What about helpers for repetitive steps? Like when you set the status code and the text at the same time, wouldn't that be easier than having two different calls? Or what about having to set the status text at all? Because usually if you're using 404, it's not found. Why do you have to add it every single time? Why don't you just, create a helper that does that for you? What about setting the error to true and adding the error message at the same time? Because if you're adding a message, an error message, it's probably going to be an error, right? So you can set that at the same time too. What about validation of your inputs? So right now we're just assuming the inputs are good. How do you handle that? So what about all the boilerplate, with our response objects and our helpers? We're doing the same thing over and over again. So there's better ways, right? We're a long way from done. We're a long way from perfect, that's for sure. So version X. So let's just look at some extra helpers here. Okay, so I'm going to add a helper called set error message. And so when you set that, it adds a message or multiple messages, as well as setting the error to true. Again, nothing major, but saves you some effort. Let's add a helper for set status code. And so the helper itself, what it will do is allow us to take a status text if we have it. If not, it'll go look one up, so you don't have to do it every time. Let's add some support for more headers. Okay. Let's add some helpers for throwing common errors. So let's have a look at the code for that. And I named it version X because I could keep going over and over and iterate more and more and more. But so what I'm doing, sort of jumping ahead a little bit. This is quite a few extra features. So we have a base object now. So if you're going to throw a 418 error, validation error, and I always get that confused. I'll have to look that one up. So we'll do that in a minute. But if you want to throw a particular type of error, you can set that up. And so here we set the status code of 418. We don't have to worry about the status text because this helper will do it itself. Okay, and we set the error message. We don't have to set the error equals true and then set a message. We can just say set error message and give in the message, and that'll do it for us. Then we can return. Now here's our throw 404. So here we have a message we can use. So the message is defaulting to not found, but if you wanted to give it more specific error message, you could. And we do a new response. We set the status code, we set the error message, and we get. So now what this allows us to do is now use this CFC, which we're extending that base. Okay. So here we have a little validation. So if user ID doesn't exist, or if it's not numeric, throw a 418 error. So now we pass in the message. User ID is required and must be numeric. Okay. Down here, we can actually add extra headers now too. So in our response, I can say response.add header, and I can put an X Gavin header in there so I can track it. Maybe I can have X environment here. And that way when I'm testing it, I know if I'm in development or staging or whatever. I can still add my data and still set it, but now I have the ability to add header or add headers. If I want to add more than one header, I can add some more there too. So I can add my cause headers if I need to. And instead of having all that code for throwing a 404, I can just say throw 404, and that uses the base function. And so we still have some boilerplate in here. We still have some code in here, which we can probably clean up some. but it's got a little nicer, a little neater, a little cleaner, and more maintainable, more consistent. All of these things are big wins for me. So these are big things I would consider when you're working on building an API. So let's look at the response real quick. So what changes here? Now we have an array of headers. So we've added that. So here's our headers variable. We default to an empty array. And look, now we have some status text. So we just put this little piece in here. We have a struct of all the different keys. So let's look at 418. It's 418 is a teapot. I always get that one confused. So we have all these different ones in here for this. So, 404 for not found, 403 is forbidden, 401 not authorized. Sorry, I just saw a comment from Camille. So I'm glad he's approving of the step-by-step method. So yeah, so this here adds us all these abilities in. So let's look. Let's jump down here to add message. So now our add message, instead of saying set messages, an add message takes a message, and it could be anything. It could be a simple value, and if it is, we basically treat it like it's the only element in the array. Otherwise, we just process the messages and we add all these messages to it. And so if you pass in an array of messages or a single message, it'll get added to the messages automatically for you. We can also add headers too. So if you add a header with a name and a string, it just appends it to the array, and it has variables.headers, and it has the name and the value. And we store that in there. And then when we go to output it, we actually loop over all the headers and the headers, and we output that. We're dropping down to the get page context, get response, so we could add the header, and we're even Java casting it. So this is how you would do it if you wanted to do this status code header instead of using the CF header. I thought I'd show you that as a comparison. So sometimes dropping down gives you a little more power, but you don't have to. You could add them with CF headers, but sometimes you may run into a few weird issues. So now we support that. And now error messages here, if we set an error message, we can set the error message, and it also takes status code and status text. So we could have actually shortened up the old base here. So I'm saying instead of setting status code, we could actually just done this. That would set the error message and the status code and the status text. So in here, you see that the error message, so it adds message, so it calls the same function, and it adds the message if it's an array or an individual to work. It also sets the error equals true. And then if the status code is not null, then it'll set the status code as well. And if the status text is not null, it'll set that. Otherwise, it sets the status text, and it'll actually look up from this list here too. Okay, so these are all little helpers. We put this in this object. We use this object everywhere, and now our life has got a little bit easier. Okay, so now we got these little throw 404s and our base CFC. So that's pretty good. Now, this is a function call, and although it's kind of nice, I got a little spoiled with ColdBox, and so what I was going to do, I was going to do an on error here. Because just like on your application CFC, you can do an on error in ColdBox, and ColdBox will catch an error inside the CFC before bubbling it up. And so I was expecting that to work. It didn't. So that was kind of funny. But you can, in your application CFC, actually catch errors. And so you can have an on error exception. And then I was messing with a few things in here too. But basically, you could say, okay, if the script name starts with the API and then whatever version or just your API, then it could actually handle the exception. So you could tell it to handle this type of exception. And then depending on the type of exception, it could return the response. But on error, it kind of hides your output. So it's a little trickier. So, I mean, there's different ways, but that's the reason I went with this approach, because this, stops it from bubbling up. It's not an actual error that bubbles, but that's usually the way we approach it. You'll actually have a bubble up type of approach where you'll catch and you'll look for the different types of exceptions. So depending on if it's a not found exception, then you would do this. If it's a validation exception, you do that. So I should probably change that. Anyways, so back to the code here. So, I forgot to show you how it actually looks. So now let's go down to the VX here. So on a success, what happens? So we get our data. Nothing's much different there until we go to headers. We click over the headers now, you'll see I've got X environment and you see development. Now we use headers in our stuff all the time we show the Docker host ID or maybe some stuff like that. So a lot of times you'll have a lot of cool stuff there set up and working. So you may want to show the IP of where it came from, what host it's running on, the environment or whatnot. So now if we have a validation error, now you get your error equals true, you got the type, 418, I'm a teapot, because I always get that one wrong. So it's April Fool's joke. And Postman actually tells you the history of it. It's kind of nice. If you get a normal error, so you got a 404, it has a different error, still sets it to true. We can still add headers in here as well. So, but what else? We haven't talked about authentication. Are you logged in? Are there cookies, sessions, JWT? There's lots of stuff there. What about authorization? Authorization, do you have the right permission? So are you logged in as authentication? Do you have the right permission as that logged in user to do something? Permissions. I haven't even touched on HTTP verbs, get, post, delete. Sure, we could add that into every single one of our functions to check to make sure that the right things are getting set. Can you only hit this on a delete? Can you only get this data on a get and not a post? You can do that, definitely. Routing. We'd love to have routes like this, right? Users /8/rents, because that's more of a RESTful route here. But how do you do this with a CFC? Users and then 8 rants, where you have to have on missing, method, or have to start passing the URL or start doing different things. A lot of things in there that you could do yourself. You could write into your old app perfectly, right? But we get to the point where we can build all that, but why reinvent the wheel? There are frameworks that already solve these problems. There are modules that already solve these problems. There are templates that already solve these problems. And so we're going to be doing more of looking to that and building APIs part 2. But what I wanted to show you is there's a lot of tools out there right now you can add into your legacy app to give you API responses right now. There's a lot of things out there that you can do to make your app have API endpoints. It may not be perfect RESTful APIs with verbs and everything else. You could do that. There's a lot of work to do that, but you can. But like I said, there's a lot of frameworks out there and there's a lot of modules out there. And so in part 2, we're going to look at more, doing that. So Charlie's going to be scheduling that soon. I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you guys how to do that and how I would do it today. So we'll be using a lot of different things. Now, I put all the code up here on this repo, but time for some questions now before we're into the hour. So let me read back real quick here. If Charlie, you want to jump in and we can maybe help me get through this here. Okay, so I see the Shutter Assault is asking about the bullet train, and I think Adam's already answered that there. Okay, so if I go back to my code real quick, yeah, this is bullet train. This is a command box module, and so yeah, so basically it reads the version of command box. It has my repo. It has information for my box my box.json. So it's actually the name of it and the version of it. It's telling me the server I'm running and if it was running or not. So yeah, that's actually bullet train. But I've got this weird Unicode error here. So, but if you're using command box, you can get bullet train. I know there's ones like that on other things as well. And I saw, yeah, Charlie did pass that in. So thanks for that. Yeah. So yeah, I think, yeah, friendly URLs. Yeah, so friendly URLs, like I said, routing is your friend there. And we could try and write our own routing system. Most frameworks have some type of routing built in. Back in the old days with Fusebox, there were certain things. And obviously like CF Wheels and ColdBox and Framework One, they support that. And Adam Tuttle, who's in the chat, helping out as well. He's got Taffy, which is his API framework as well, and it handles HTTP verbs and URLs, routing, and all that. So there's a lot of frameworks out there that do that. You can probably get your own friendly URLs, but essentially you have to have your app handle that. And so depending on what your app has, there's multiple different ways to do that, right? So if you're running a homegrown framework, maybe you already built something and you could handle that. And so with, like I said, in part 2, we'll show you how we do it with ColdBox. I know that Dan Wilson did a presentation with Ray Camden, and he showed off a little bit Adam Tuttle's Taffy, and so you can do that there too. So I'm going to show you using ColdBox's HMVC REST. We're going to use some cool modules. We'll use some CFGuard for actually having permissions. We'll look at JWTs. We'll look at a lot of good stuff and what those powerful things that you can have. But if your app is legacy, then you really have to see, does your app currently have a routing system? Because friendly URLs are amazing. I would definitely prefer to use something like this. That's what RESTful routes are based around, the resource. So this here, for those who aren't sure, like, this is an endpoint for users. So then this ID here is the user ID. So now I'm asking for just the rants of user number 8. And so that's pretty readable for most people. The code itself is up on my repo here, so we'll be sharing it. But it's at GitHub. If you go to github.com and go to gpickin, you'll find it. It's the most recent repo, and it's OCFM, so Online CF Meetup 2020 Building APIs Part 1. And inside there's a little database file too, so you can actually run it. The username I have is Gavin, but you can do whatever you want there. Add another user to the system and just play with it. But again, all we looked at today was just the users. So that's a simple little call to get a user, but look at all the work we had to do. And like I said, you can definitely do it yourself. And a lot of people can't just drop in, a framework like Taffy or, ColdBox or whatever to do it. And so hopefully you guys will learn some of the cool things that make your life easier. That response object was a huge change. When we added that into our ColdBox APIs a long time ago, our life got so much better. Doing things like the methods to catch the errors and handle them all the same way was great. And like I said, in ColdBox, you can bubble them up right now, and that was really neat. So there's a lot of cool things out there, but what I gave you hopefully today will be useful for even in apps where you can't go and grab one of those frameworks. You can't use some of the new modules, but hopefully there's some of the tools there and some ideas on what's important in your app. But I would definitely look at routing and HTTP verbs. Those are the two big things that we're missing here, and I could have tried to build them, but I just like I said, for me that's a lot of work. And if you're using a framework or homegrown or something, like, it would clash, it wouldn't be perfect. So I think that's pretty interesting. And one more thing though too is, if you really want to look, there's a Fluent API presentation I did not too long ago too, for online and stuff, and that one there sort of the next evolution as well, and that's sort of the breadcrumb thing. So but anyway, so hopefully that gives you guys a good taste and shows you how to build APIs today, and hopefully you guys will come back and see what you're missing on and what could make your API even stronger, more powerful, and easy to work with.
Awesome, Gavin. Thank you for that. And before people start heading out, just a couple things. Could you grab that URL for the repo and drop it into the chat? That'll be easier for people to click on it then. And just earlier, I made a comment, and I think it's worth pulling out for everybody's sake. You were showing things running on Lucy, but I don't think there's anything that you showed that would act differently on CF, right?
There's one thing that my favorite little piece of code in Lucy that ColdFusion doesn't do is this return type equals array in your query execute. So without that, it gives you an ugly query. So those of you who have done serialized JSON on a ColdFusion query, it doesn't look good. It has all the column outputs and whatever. So there's maybe I'll go and add a CFC, a ColdFusion version of it. But essentially, if you'll just get a query back here, and it won't be an array. It'll be a query object, and so you have to treat it a little differently. So yeah, other than that, everything else will work. And so maybe. And
until then, I'm pretty sure that in the cflive.org site, there's a query to array function that somebody could toss in to use that with CF.
Yeah, that's what you do. And this just does it natively. It's faster, it's cleaner. But
of course. But I just wanted to clarify, because when you showed the dumps, it was clear that it was Lucy, and I just didn't want anybody to somehow think that what you were saying was somehow unique to Lucy. Just that one thing was. Maybe in the future other things will be, and you might want to clarify that in the part 2 if it comes up, because some people will just take the stuff and try to run it on CF. And then there was a point where you were talking about the return format and adding it to the function definition, which one can do. But in your Postman, you were showing calling the query string with return format. And I don't think you really pulled that out in your discussion. So I just want to make sure people understand that. They may not have watched the chat. Yeah, that if you look at your version 5 was the last one where you did it. Or maybe it was 4. I think 4 was the last one you did it, and 5 was the first one where you didn't. Yeah, so just check that out. There is that option up at the top in gray. Oops. Yeah. There you go. To have that return format JSON. That's a feature of CF and Lucy when you're just starting out, rather than change your code to return that return format. You can just try using the query string to do it. But then
exactly.
There's benefit of doing it in the code. And then I think it was Bilal that was making a point about concerns about separating notions of return format from your code. And there's certainly arguments to be made. You may notice that he never was returning JSON in his code. He let that function define that what was to go out was JSON. And in the case of the query, it did turn it to JSON, but it left it to be a query JSON object instead of a array. Exactly. So those are other options people could consider, but it's nice that CFML makes it so easy.
Yeah, and see, and usually what I do is I have an API handler, and it'll pull out to my model, and my model is my user CFC. But I just didn't want to have, user.
Sure. No, that's great for your part 1. This is the way to show it, because people are gonna. I mean, I agree with those who commented it that it was. I think it's really helpful to see starting from scratch and evolving over time. And there's just a whole bunch of things that Taffy added, that ColdFusion's REST framework added.
Oh yeah, exactly. And I didn't even mention that. You're right. The ColdFusion REST framework and even the Lucy REST, they've got. I was about to say that. Yeah, they've got options too, and so.
And they add all kinds of additional things, and that's the point of any framework, is to take away some of this administrivia that you have to deal with on your own, and that's what you'll get at some in part 2. But it was great to build up to it with this part 1. So before you go, there is one last question there down at the bottom. I'll pop it up on the screen.
Yep. Can you provide tips on using env for config? Yeah, I mean, the good thing about the .env is once you install the module, and I put it in the README, just do a box install, because in our box.json, I actually put these 2 dependencies so you can get them running. But yeah, the .env, I'll show you mine because my password's blank, so it's not that scary. But basically just have your environment variables set up here. And to be honest, you can probably hard code most of these straight into your CF config. But in here, we just have a data source. And so you give it a name and you put in your connection details. And if you're sharing it with a bunch of people, you may not want the password in there. So you just have the .env set up. I always recommend ignoring that .env so your personal private stuff is never added to your repo. But if you have an example file set up with most of the pertinent information, it makes it easy for someone else to get up and running. Usually they just change the password and maybe the host, wherever the database server is. But yeah, I mean, it's just pretty simple as far as, it's just a name and a value. And command box automatically loads them up for you. When you start your server, it'll load up all these variables into the environment variables just for command box. And then your CFconfig JSON file allows you to replace certain things. So you don't have to have every single one of these as variables, but you can just have just the ones you need to change, just the ones you want to sort of hide. But yeah, it's really useful. And like I said, just for, I don't know how many times you've changed code because maybe a username or a password was different, or you have to log into the admin to do it. This just saves me having to do that when I start up a new site. It automatically has my data source set up. I can set up my caching. I can set up all my configuration that I want. And if there's a site that I like, I can just export it with CFconfig, get my JSON file, and then I can use that on all my apps. And that way, I always have the same request timeouts that I want. I always have the settings. So,
and in case anybody was only half listening when he started on this subject, this is about using CFconfig, which is a module of command box, which people use to spin up instances easily. And this is showing how that CFconfig makes it easy to automate the spinning up of those instances. And it's a lot more powerful than that. We could have a whole webinar on CFconfig. I don't know that Brad's done one, but there's some on CFcasts. ColdFusionMeetup.com already
Yeah.
talking about that. And I'll just throw out too that CF 2021 or whatever it's going to be called is going to be adding a somewhat equivalent subset of what they call CF setup to build JSON configuration and pass it in at startup. It's not as powerful as CF config, but at least it's going to be there for those who may, like you said, sometimes people can't switch to something else. They have to use what they have. But anyway, there was a more, I think, pressing point. Josh Ford dropped in. If you didn't catch it, he was sharing here that when you're doing the serialization of the JSON, there is the serialization function in CFML, and if you use in your application CFC this .serialization.serialize query as struct, that would convert it at least to a struct, not an array, but at least it wasn't a query. So that's pretty cool. And then he threw in one more thing, which I think is, or sorry, Bruce asked you a question there. Gavin, somehow you got removed. I didn't remove you.
Yeah, I couldn't add the comment into the thing, so I clicked the login button because I hadn't logged in, I guess, and so
wow.
And then it kicked me out of it. So
oh goodness.
Anyway,
welcome back.
Yeah. I think Accesses was added before 2016, wasn't it? Was it CF11? I don't remember when Accesses were added. It was pretty old though, I believe.
Right.
Do you remember, Charlie?
Yeah, I think it was quite a while ago. I don't
maybe
remember
even CF10.
exactly.
I'll have to look
or
it
even
up
earlier.
Docs. Yeah,
I think it may have been even earlier.
Yeah, because I remember like the CF9 days, we were having all the object-oriented stuff, and I'm sure Accesses would have been
well,
around.
and CFCs came out with CF6, and I'm pretty sure that was something that came up with implicit setters and getters, and everything was in like 7 or 8. But anyway, people can look into that.
Yeah, but yeah, I definitely like the serialize query as struct. Yeah, I like that setting too. There's a bunch of different ways. I just like say it's nice to have that that option, especially work at APIs and convert it to JSON. So, but yeah, I think that's it from me. I will send you. Oh, yeah, I'll tweet that out, the link for the repo right now, since I can't comment. Sorry about that, everybody.
Well, that's so funny. Really, you can't. Well, go ahead and remove yourself for a second. Oh, you're saying you couldn't even. I'll tell you what.
I'll do it in a separate window. Hold on.
Send it to me. Send it to me in the private chat. Oh, there you go. Is that what you did? There you go.
I did before. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, it wasn't. It's just not obvious. That private chat doesn't jump up for me as readily as it could. And now I go back to the comments, and I can do that. I'm really surprised you as a speaker can't do that, but. This is StreamYard, folks who don't know. StreamYard is a really awesome service, a lot of great features, but that's an interesting quirk if it doesn't let the speaker or a participant in what they call the studio be able to put something into the comments. But I just did. So there's the link to his repo, which has the code, has the slides, and you said has a database as well, right?
Yep, there's just a simple little database. Nice. Yeah, and it's basically all set up just to be an example that we use for when you're building ColdBox 0 to here. I just trimmed it down and made it as legacy as I could, so hopefully everyone could.
And that's good, because a lot of people are legacy and they got to start somewhere, learn to walk, and then they can learn to run. And that's what you'll do in part 2. Take them on a jog.
Yep, be showing them how I do it today, basically. So show them a lot of cool features, and a lot of the stuff that you've seen here at the end is very similar because I'm used to using certain things like the response object, and that's very similar to what we have in ColdBox now. That's built in and it's available. You don't have to make your own. It's there and it's easily accessible. And then we have some powerful things in ColdBox like the routing, that gives you all those user-friendly URLs, and we have verbs, HTTP verbs support, and we have resourceful routes for automatic route creation. A lot of cool stuff. JWT, JOTs, a lot of good stuff. So I'll try and jam as much as I can that into part 2, and I'll give them resources to find it even more. Or
if not, save more for part 3.
Yeah, part 3, 4, 5. They're going to be sick of me soon. So
no, we'll look forward to it. And you mentioned Taffy, and I can't tell in StreamYard whether somebody's here or not. But if Adam's still here, I'll just put out a plea that people I think would enjoy seeing a presentation on it. I'll also throw out that if you just Google Taffy framework, I think it's taffy.io. I'm not going to stop right now to try to find out. But he's also started recently, after a couple years of it's been out for like 10 years, and he's recently really re-engaged with community, and he's doing more blog posts. He's doing videos, so you don't have to wait for that. you can check that out on your own. But I'd love to have him on if you'd like to do it.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll be, like I said, it'd be interesting. There's lots of different things out there and different ways to approach it, and yeah, it's definitely a step up from trying to do it all yourself. And that was sort of my key here. Yeah, there's a lot of good things you can do, but it's not the only way. And so if you need to go further and more, maybe look at a framework or library and come find out more about it in November.
Sure, that'll be more clear as you go. And that will be November 12th. For those who are interested, we will get that announcement out shortly. Also, Stuart popped in earlier and said accessors are in CF10. It's not clear if he means he sees that they were there at least in 10, or if he's saying they were introduced in 10. It'd be interesting to hear if he knows for sure, if anybody knows. But then I see there's Adam saying he's here, and thank you, and yes. All right, he's preparing a talk. Awesome. So we'll look forward to hearing from you when you're ready to do that, Adam.
Very cool.
And I'll repeat that anybody here listening, you're welcome to give a presentation. We'd love to have as many talks as people want to give. If we could do it every week, we would. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. But again, thanks, Gavin, for coming on. And I wanted to thank Dan Wilson for helping arrange your talk and a couple of other the recent talks. He's been great in helping us get more speakers, and it's always helpful finding speakers who want to present. There's a lot of you out there, and I always have the door open, but it's great to have people beat the bushes. So you too, folks, if you know somebody who has a talk you'd like to see, please encourage them to come on.
Yep, for sure. That's fun. Thank you for having me, Charlie. And yeah, I'm glad people got something out of it. So
sure, thank you. And Stuart said they exist in 10. So again, when the question stands on when they were added, yeah, exactly. But anyway, if anybody's really interested, find out. Maybe on the next one we'll have the answer. But thanks again, Gavin. Thanks to everybody for coming on. I see your thank yous that you're sharing. And I'll go ahead and stop the session, which will stop the recording, and it'll be posted later today automatically by mechanisms underlying this and YouTube. So
very cool.
Thanks for coming on, everybody. Thank you again for Gavin. Talk to y'all later.
Thanks. Bye.
You betcha, sir. See you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Camille.